Hey everyone, welcome to this live session by Simplilearn. Our topic for today is cybersecurity training for beginners. Here we will acquaint you with various cybersecurity concepts and help you learn cybersecurity from scratch. Let's wait for a bit as people join in. Before we proceed, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to never miss an update from Simplilearn. Now, let's jump in and see what's in store for us. We have an interesting lineup for this session. Firstly, we look at the rise of cybercrimes with the help of real-world cyberattacks. Then we will move on to understanding the various types of cyberattacks we can fall prey to, following which we will brief you with the importance of cybersecurity. After that, we will understand various networking terminologies as networking is the foundation of cybersecurity. Our next topic will acquaint you with cybersecurity goals, and finally we will have a look at how you can tackle cybercrimes. So without further ado, let's begin with the rise of cybercrimes. So let's talk about the WannaCry cyber attack. This is something that happened way back in 2017. This attack took the world by storm. It encrypted the data of organizations, and hackers demanded ransom from those organizations to decrypt their own data. So what exactly happened? Well, this attack originated in May 2017 in Asia and then spread across the world. And how did this happen? Well, there was a vulnerability that was identified in Microsoft Windows, the SMB vulnerability. SMB, which is server message block, is essentially the file sharing and the printer sharing services that you use in a LAN environment on Windows operating system. By default, these are enabled on your desktop, and there is a hardening guide that people utilize to either upgrade the version of SMB to a more secure version or disable SMB and utilize something else. Now, this was an unknown vulnerability and this was targeted, and within days, more than 230,000 computers were infected across 150 countries. So, the victims were the users who used the unsupported version of Microsoft Windows and those users who hadn't installed the new Microsoft Security Update of April 2017. Now, when we say this was unidentified, Microsoft knew of this vulnerability, and in fact, they had released a patch in April of 2017 to mitigate this vulnerability. Within 2 months of that release, this attack had happened. Now, in a real-world scenario, it is not possible for all the servers and devices to be upgraded to the latest patch level, because organizations need to test those patches to see if those patches are going to interfere with the services that they are providing. And hence, no organization will completely patch up at any point in time. And this was the flaw that sadly took down a lot of organizations. The patch was available, but some were not utilizing it yet. And they did not see it as a high-value risk, and suddenly something happened and a WannaCry took place now. So what happened was a crypto worm called WannaCry, which basically encrypts the data and locks the user out of their own computers, and they get the screen in front of them which says, "Your data has been encrypted," and it gives them a link, and they're demanded to pay $300 to $600 to the hackers to retrieve the decryption key for their data. Now here, obviously, you're not going to pay cash to hackers, neither are you going to make a bank transfer, because both of the ways you can identify the hackers and then track them down. So the hackers demanded this exchange via Bitcoin's cryptocurrency. This is the best way to remain anonymous and the best way to make payments over the internet without being identified. So what was the impact of this attack? Around 200,000 to 300,000 computers were infected. It sounds like a small number of computers when you're talking about the global volume. However, the services that it affected were very huge. In UK, it was the National Health Service, and the frequencies of the patients were postponed here. FedEx, Renault, Nissan, all of these organizations got compromised, and the production lines basically shut down for a few days till the data retrieved from backup is restored. And then they try to bring back everything to normal. This shows what a huge impact the WannaCry attack had on the world. Next, let us have a look at the attack faced by Dunkin' Donuts. In February 2019, Dunkin' Donuts announced that the users of its rewards programs were targeted by a credential stuffing attack. That means that the attacker stole the credentials, usernames, and passwords of customers of Dunkin' Donuts. Now we think Dunkin' Donuts, they sell donuts, how much could it impact anyone? But if you have an online account with Dunkin' Donuts, you also have your personal identifiable information stored in those accounts. For example, your name, address, credit card information, maybe your social security number or your national insurance card or something like that, which can lead to identity theft. People can misuse that information, pretend to be you, and then take out loans or do transactions in your name, where you're going to end up paying those bills. So stealing of such kind of data is going to impact all the users adversely. Here, the first name, last name, and email IDs were stolen. This is still good enough to launch social engineering attacks and target these victims through phishing attacks or similar attacks. Now that we saw a few real-world examples of cyber attacks, let's now look into the different types of cyber attacks. So we are going to discuss these 6 types of attacks. They are malware, social engineering attacks, man-in-the-middle attack, denial of service, SQL injections, and password attacks. If you look at this, malwares basically target host operating systems. Social engineering attacks would address or attack the gullibility of a human being with the help of a computer, for example, sending a fake mail or hosting a fake website. Man-in-the-middle attack would target a network and then try to capture data packets within the network, thus compromising your credentials. A denial of service attack would crash a service. SQL injection attacks would attack an application, and a password attack would attack the usernames and passwords of accounts, thus taking advantage of weak passwords and getting access to your accounts. So let's start with malware. Malware basically refers to malicious software. The first part of malicious mal and the ware out of software becomes malware. Malwares are nothing but vehicles in which hackers embed payloads. Payloads could be viruses, worms, ransomware, trojans. So they hide these kind of malicious software within the legitimate looking softwares and post them on the internet. People who are interested in those kind of software will obviously download them, and since they are looking very legitimate, they will try to install them, thus accidentally and unknowingly installing a Trojan virus or a ransomware on their machine. Now, most of us have done this at one point in time, where we have looked at pirated software because we did not want to pay for it, and then we probably go to torrents and then search for those softwares, download them, and there's a keygen.exe over there, which we have to execute, and then we have to copy that code, the exe file that comes out, or the keygen that you have to replace it. And it's a very convoluted process, but the fact that you have to restore some code with some other code would basically mean that there is something wrong with that file. So 99% of the time, these programs would have viruses or trojans embedded within them, and it is going to affect the security posture of your computers. If you scan a keygen.exes with any antivirus across the globe, they will always report them as malware, and they will probably want to delete those kind of files. So how do the user machines get infected? It gets infected into a system when a user clicks on suspicious links. Now, obviously, if you think it is a suspicious link, you're not going to click on it, but you trust the link or you're compelled to click on it just out of curiosity. Let's say you click on that link, there's a redirector, it downloads an attachment from a malicious server, and it gets installed on your machine. Most of the common ways a virus or a worm is spread is through USB devices people pass around, and you have no idea where the device has been used before, and you plug it into your machine, and if there is a virus on that USB device, it will get infected on your machine as well. Then let's talk about social engineering attack. Now this is where your people skills come into the picture. This is the art of manipulating people and convincing them to give up confidential information, either knowingly or unknowingly. So most likely, we trust our friends, right? And we talk to them a lot and we give out some confidential information which we would not give out to others. What if somebody is pretending to be our friend and just to get this information out of us? And we trust this person, we give out that information, and we certainly get affected because of it. That I'm not saying that everybody in the world does that, but it is one of the most common attacks that is experienced in the computing world. Now, social engineering attacks can be broken down into 3 categories. Here we have phishing attack, spear phishing attack, and whaling attack. First is a phishing attack where you're targeting a user by sending out fake mails or fake websites and their gullibility into clicking on those links and then giving out information. Basically, it is a practice wherein a hacker usually sends fake mails which look really genuine or hosts fake websites which also look genuine and looks like they're from a trusted source. Once you click on those links, there would be embedded scripts or embedded malware which would then be executed and then get installed on your machines, compromising the security of your device. These utilities could be used to steal your credit card information, steal data from your computer, upload data to your computer, use your computer as a bot, and anything and everything that the hacker might want to do. Spear phishing is a variation of phishing. Now, phishing is a non-targeted attack. It is to the whole world at large, whoever becomes a victim. However, spear phishing is targeted attack. It is to a specific individual or a group of individuals in an organization. So it becomes a customized attack. You identify the victim, you identify the flaws that are existing in the organization, you identify the gullibility of the victim, create that fake mail to suit that particular situation, send it across to them. They'll then click on that link and get infected by whatever payloads that you have embedded with it. Meanwhile, whaling is when you are targeting particularly wealthy or powerful people in the industry. So normally when you're targeting the CEOs, CFOs, high-level management people of an organization, it would be known as whaling attack. Then we come to the network attacks. Man in the middle, this is also known as an eavesdropping attack, which literally means that you're going to listen in onto somebody's conversation. For example, in the figure, the client is trying to talk to the server, but you become a man in the middle and you try to listen in onto the conversation. This is going on now. Obviously, the conversation over here may not be audio, but with data that is being exchanged between the server and the client. You just listen in and you make a copy of that data, you store it at your end. The data could contain usernames, passwords. It may also contain confidential information and help you compromise data. The attacking computer takes the IP address of the client. The client is not aware of this. How about this, that the client is trying to communicate with the server? You spoof yourself as a default gateway or as a trusted device, and the client thinks that this is through you that they need to communicate to the server, and thus they start sending data via your PC. So this attack normally happens on public Wi-Fi networks. Thus, it is recommended that you don't use public Wi-Fis. For example, you go to a coffee shop, they have free Wi-Fi there and you connect to it. Start surfing, you start browsing, you're always signed into Google, Facebook accounts, your bank accounts and whatnot. And then there's a sniffer, there is a hacker who's doing a man-in-the-middle attack, capturing all that data. Now, it's not an easy attack, but it can be done. So this diagram shows where the man-in-the-middle attack has become successful, and now that the client and the server both are sending information without knowing that the attacker is capturing all the data. Then comes the denial of service attack. The motive in a DOS attack is not to benefit monetarily, but to bring down a service for legitimate users. That is just causing harm to the organization. For example, if I consume the bandwidth of to a particular website, since there is no more bandwidth left, other legitimate users who want to interact with website will not be able to connect to the website, thus creating a denial of service to those legitimate users. Now, it may not be possible for me to use my laptop to target a cluster of servers because obviously the bandwidth at the other end would be very high. So I would distribute my attack across multiple devices, thus creating a distributed denial of service called a DDoS attack. Then we come to the SQL injection. SQL stands for Structured Query Language, which is the language that is used by applications to interact with websites. So let it be a Microsoft SQL database, MySQL database, Oracle SQL. The syntax may be a little bit different, but it is still the structured query language that applications utilize to interact with the database. Now, the queries that are created by the applications need to be checked at the application level itself. So developers need to be very careful of how they're going to create those queries. What queries are allowed to go to the database? Because the database is designed to answer queries. It doesn't know what is a legitimate query. If it receives a query, it is going to try to execute it and give out information. Thus, a hacker may insert a malicious query or malicious queries into a SQL server through the vulnerable application, causing a security event. So depending on the queries that have been created, the attacker could delete some data or modify, add, edit data, or do anything that would compromise the integrity and the security of the database. For example, the Dunkin' Donuts attack, apart from being a credential stuffing attack, since they got access to the database, they could have added or deleted any information about any users that were there. Then we come to the most common attacks, password attack. This is the easiest way to hack into a system by cracking a password of a user. This is done in multiple ways. So there would be a brute force attack where you try every combination out of the alphabet or the character set that is allowed to be utilized to create passwords. For example, we have password policies, right? Alphabet in uppercase and lowercase, A through Z capitals, and in lowercase 0 through 9 for numerical values, and alphanumeric characters or special characters like exclamation marks, percentile, ampersands, etc. So we are normally encouraged to create a randomized password with all of these in a randomized manner. It should not be based on a dictionary word. It should not be our names or our phone numbers or phone numbers in reverse. So why are these policies created? These policies are essentially created to create a password that is difficult to crack even by a brute force attack. So if you've got a lengthy password which is very randomized with numeric, alphanumeric special characters and whatnot, it would be very difficult, and the compute level that it may consume may make this attacker redundant. For example, a 16-character password which is hashed using SHA-256 would take around single PC. Now imagine the amount of time it takes. It is a 100% successful attack, but the time it takes may make it redundant. Meanwhile, a dictionary attack is where you're creating a file which will have a list of all the common passwords that are utilized by users. So instead of the permutations and combinations of all the alphabets or all the characters, you're just creating a list of all the probable passwords that may be utilized, and then you're comparing those passwords to see if those passwords match. So these kinds of attacks are effective against users who use very commonly used passwords, dictionary-based words, as their passwords. Now let's talk about the types of network attacks. An active attack. An attack when the intruder attempts to disrupt a network's normalcy and modifies the data and alters the data at the same time. So as we can see in the diagram, there's a sender and there's a receiver. Attacker is the man in the middle who is trying to create the active attack. So when the sender sends the data to the receiver, the attacker intercepts that data, modifies the data, and then sends it back to the receiver. Since the attacker is a man in the middle, as we have seen in the previous attacks, neither the receiver nor the sender would be aware of the attacker, and thus they would not be aware of the modification that has been done. Meanwhile, in a passive attack, the intruder just eavesdrops on the data, they just listen in on to the conversation, but they do not modify the data at any time. So they just capture the packets, they copy the contents so that they can use that at a later stage. So we have seen all of these attacks so far, but what is the motivation behind them? Why would anyone want to create these attacks, and for what particular reason? So let's talk about the reasons for cyber attacks. Now let's start off with cyber terrorism. It is an attack carried out by a group of terrorists against nations to fulfill their agendas. They attack crucial infrastructure. Often information of a company would be compromised, thus crippling their infrastructure, and then the terrorists would take advantage and demand ransom or whatever their cause is. Next is cyber warfare. Nations hack into another nation's network to cause damage. By doing so, critical data is stolen and infrastructure can also be hampered. Now, this is where espionage happens. Countries are known to spy on each other, especially their enemies, and enemy at any point in time would want to know what the other nations are doing. So earlier on, we used to look at spy movies where we used to plant spies and send spies across the borders, across the lands, and try to spy on them. Now we can do that sitting at home, or rather we can do that through our computers. And this is exactly what cyber warfare is. Cyber espionage. This is a technology which is used to gain information without the consent from its owner. Now, this can be in a political situation or in a corporate situation. where a computer is trying to spy on their other vendors and trying to figure out how their business models are more successful or what their business strategies are, so that these guys can keep a step or two ahead of their competitors. And finally, the most common of all, personal differences. Somebody hates somebody and they want to take revenge, and that is why cyber attacks can take place as well. So this is why we want cybersecurity. Cybersecurity should be in place to prevent these kinds of attacks. So what exactly is cybersecurity? It refers to the practice of protecting networks, programs, computer systems, and their components from unauthorized digital access and attacks. So whatever your digital footprint, could it be servers, computers, switches, routers, web servers, web applications that you're hosting, or services that you're consuming from the cloud or providing to other customers, you need to secure all of these to ensure that the integrity and the confidentiality of these services is intact and none of these services are affected by any cyber attacks which could lead to disastrous results. So the main difference we want to understand here is the difference between cybersecurity and information security. Well, information security is data within the organization where they handle sensitive information or proprietary information, copyrighted or printed information, and they want to secure it from data leaks. Cybersecurity is basically a technique used to protect the integrity of a network. So this is when you're going to go on the web and on the internet. You're going to secure your devices that you have deployed, allowing people to access your infrastructure from the outside. So what could be the cost of not being cyber secure? If you get hacked, or if your data is compromised, or if your information is compromised, you could have a lot of repercussions. Your goodwill will go for a toss. You may be open for lawsuits, not only from clients but from customers as well. You could be open for fines or penalties from government organizations for failing to follow the law of the land. Customer trust will obviously be hampered if you have been hacked and your data has been compromised. You wouldn't want to deal with that organization in the future. All of this could land the organization in a financial crisis where all the lawsuits and penalties that are being imposed could basically bankrupt that organization and thus take it out of circulation. So now let's look at some basic network terminologies which we need to understand to go further into the cybersecurity world. First and foremost, network. What is a network? It is nothing but a group of interconnected devices. It could be servers, could be workstations, could be laptops, could be any device, file printers and whatnot to be interconnected with each other. As you can see in the diagram, it is used for communication. It's primarily used for data transmissions and to communicate between various terminals. It is also used to share data, information. It could be wired or wireless. So you've got a wired LAN, or at home we all have wireless networks where we connect all our devices. We use them for streaming videos, we use them to connect to the internet. A network is nothing but a collection of interconnected devices that are allowed to communicate with each other freely so that the business can be continued in a proper manner. Next, we have server. Server is nothing but a hardware device that is supposed to handle requests of data, information, allow network services to function from other computers and devices. So this is where we build a client-server relationship, where on the server we have got the major software, we got the data that is stored over there, and clients and interact with the server to consume that data in a particular manner that would help them make sense and analyze that data and generate business out of them. Then, Internet. Internet is nothing but the collection of multiple networks globally. So all the networks that we have across the globe, when they are interconnected with each other, that is what Internet is. And if you just go back and talk about servers, this is what allows the internet to be formed. So every organizations, when they publish their servers on the internet and they allow everyone to interconnect through these servers, so that is where the internet comes in. Be the servers being the backbone of the internet. Obviously, for the servers to communicate with each others, we will need switches, routers and other devices for data transmissions to happen. So these are the multiple networks that could be individual networks interconnected together to form the internet across the globe. Next, we have TCP/IP. For the internet to work, there would be a set of protocols for transmissions to be allowed across the globe. Now, this is where TCP/IP or the Transmission Control Protocol over Internet Protocol comes into the picture. So if you remember, we use communication channels like TCP or the Transmission Control Protocol and UDP, User Datagram Protocol, when we connect to web servers. We talked about the HTTP protocol, and if you want to secure, then we'll talk about the IMAP, POP3, and all of these protocols. Now, where do these protocols come from? It is nothing but a suite of the TCP/IP software, which contains all of these protocols, which allow computers to communicate with each other. If TCP/IP wouldn't have been there, our network would have collapsed. Now, when we have the TCP/IP and we want to communicate across the globe, how do we identify devices on the internet? Because the devices don't know us, they are not going to use our usernames and passwords to communicate with each other. But when I want to connect to a website or a device, how do I identify it on the intranet or the internet? I obviously use IP address. Now, IP addresses are nothing but the Internet Protocol addresses. As shown on your screen, here's an example. Now, there's a lot of classification of IP addresses, and some of these IP addresses work on the internet, some of them are supposed to work on private LANs. Next, we have MAC addresses. The second way that we are identified on the internet or the intranet are with MAC addresses. So, media access controls or MAC addresses are hard-coded addresses given to our network interface cards. These cannot be modified physically at any point in time. However, there are techniques to spoof MAC addresses which we can then obfuscate our existing address and give us a new one. Next, we have router. We have been talking about routers and switches. Router is nothing but a device that passes packets back and forth across the networks. It routes the data in the appropriate path, so it is an intelligent device. It can understand IP addresses and MAC addresses. It can identify different paths of reaching a particular network. For example, if I'm sitting in India and I want to communicate across the world to America, it is the routers that would map this path, store it in their cache. So when I try to connect to that server, they would retrieve it from the cache and send the packet across the globe. So the home router as we use at home on Wi-Fi is our default gateway to connect to the internet. Thus, it allows our internal devices to communicate with each other using internal IP addresses. And then when we want to connect to the internet, after routing, it'll send the packet to other servers that we want to communicate with. Next up, we have domain. Now, what is a domain? A domain is referred to as a group of computers and other devices that are interconnected and treated as a whole. Now, a domain is used by an organization. So let's say if I'm XYZ, being the name of the organization, and I want to create a domain which would allow me to create a group of interconnected computers for my employees to interconnect with each other and send and manage data. I'm going to create a domain for my organization and attach all the devices, create users and interconnect them using a domain. So that is why you are going to have a centralized approach of a server-client relationship where you are going to have a main domain and you're going to have devices connected to the domain. Now, when we go onto the internet, the domain name is nothing but the base part of a website. So when you say google.com and you type it in your browser, you're taken to the web page called google.com, which is the search engine that you're connected. But for Google, the organization at the other end, they would have a data center over there, which would have all the relevant data, which allows you to search throughout the information. So for them, the domain would be a data center where all that information is stored. But for us consumers, a website called google.com would be a domain for us to visit that particular website and consume the services that they are offering on the internet. So here's the example. It is HTTPS, which means that it is secure website port 443, and we're connecting to cybersecurity.com. Cybersecurity.com becomes a domain name. HTTPS becomes a protocol that we want to utilize to connect to that particular website. Next, we have DNS, or the domain name system. It is nothing but an index, something like a phone book which is responsible for mapping the domain name into its corresponding IP address. Now remember, as mentioned earlier, there are only two ways of being identified on the internet, either the MAC address or the IP address. If it is devices, if it is computers, it would obviously be IP addresses. But if I type in google.com, I'm giving it a domain name. So there is a DNS server which is an index or works like an index, or moreover a phone book which will have a list of all the domains with the corresponding IP addresses. So whenever I type in google.com, the request goes to a DNS server. The DNS server is queried, the IP address of google.com is identified, pasted it onto the packet, and then the packet is routed through the router to the path that it has in mind to reach google.com server. Here, you can replace google.com with cybersecurity.com as seen on the screen. The local PC queries the DNS server. The DNS server replies back with the IP address. Now, if you're wondering how does this work, If we take an example of home network, the ISP gives us default gateway or a router within their IP address for DNS servers and default gateways. So when we try to connect to the router has the IP, another DNS server, and it routes that query to the DNS server. The DNS server replies back with appropriate IP address. The router then takes the IP address, figures out the path, and sends it across the targeted server. Next up, we have DHCP, or the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. It is a protocol that dynamically assigns IP addresses to the devices in the network. So we have discussed that IP addresses are required by computers to communicate with each other, but who associates or who gives these IP addresses to these computers? So for that to happen, we have got a DHCP server that is created. If you take your home networks, it is a router that has the DHCP rule installed on it. So whenever a machine boots up, it sends out a broadcast request looking for the DHCP server, and then there is a communication with the DHCP server. The DHCP server then allocates an IP address to the computer who's requesting it, and once the IP address is allocated on the entries, when the DHCP server's cache with the corresponding MAC address of that particular machine. Moving on, we have VPN. The next topic called VPN, or a virtual private network. It is a connection between a VPN server and a VPN client. It's basically an encrypted channel that you're creating between two endpoints, and the main reason for a VPN is to encrypt your data, so that it is now no longer subject to man-in-the-middle or eavesdropping or modification attacks. So this is a layer of security that you're adding when you are connecting to the internet using an encrypted channel, which would prevent you from getting hacked or your data being compromised by hackers. So as you can see here, and if you remember the previous talks that we have seen, the hacker was able to copy the data very easily. Now that it is an encrypted channel, even if the hacker tries to eavesdrop and capture the data, it will format it in such a way that they would not be able to make sense out of it. Now the attacker or the hacker will have to try to decrypt the data, so that's another attack that they would have to execute to find out the encryption key, decrypt the data, and then look at what the data was. Now let's understand what bots are before moving to botnet. Bots are nothing but the softwares that can be installed on vulnerable machines that would allow the hacker to send commands to infect machines to generate some traffic or to do what the command tells him to do. Most of the botnets are used for distributed denial of service attack. If you remember the DOS and the DDoS that we discussed a while back, this is where we tie up with how they are executed. So a bot master or a hacker would try to identify vulnerable devices across the internet and try to install the bot onto those devices. The bot is essentially a software that would revert back to the bot master and advertise their availability whenever they have been powered on. A collection of such infested devices would essentially be called a botnet. When there are enough number of machines that the attacker feels good enough to launch the attack on targeted servers, the hacker will then initiate those devices, send commands to the bot master, to the bots, and the bots would then generate that kind of traffic, but whatever they have been configured for, and then attack the targeted server. Now, this is also done to optimize the identity of the hackers. Since the attack is being generated through the botnet, the IP addresses of the botnet computers would be reported to the target. So, not the actual hacker's IP address. So, it would be very difficult to find out who the hacker was. And this also depends on the size of the botnet. So this you can see is the attack that has been created over the victims, and the malicious traffic has been generated through the botnet and the victims have been targeted through that. So as mentioned, once the attack has been done, when it comes to forensically investigating at the victim's end, they would find the IP addresses of the botnet and not the attacker. Now let's start talking about network security controls. Network security controls are nothing but implementations of various devices to enhance the security of a particular network. These could be firewalls, intrusion detection systems, or intrusion prevention systems, honeypots, etc. Let's look at a review of what these devices are now. A firewall can be a hardware or a software that is responsible for allowing or disallowing a certain amount of traffic to or from your computer. So these are basically created to enhance the security posture of your network, where you can configure for certain level of traffic to be allowed and disallowed. Now, a firewall is not going to decide by itself what is a good amount of traffic or what is bad traffic. You are going to configure the firewall by creating rules based on the IP address, port numbers, protocols. Based on this, the firewall will then analyze if the incoming traffic is good or not, and if it should be allowed or not. In case of explicit rules which says deny the traffic, it will drop the packets or it will delete the packets. It will not allow the packets to go past. So if it is good traffic, that means it reaches a rule that has been created that allows the traffic to go through the firewall and it will allow it. If it's bad traffic, that means there is a rule which denies that traffic to pass through. It will get blocked at the firewall level itself and it will not enter the network. Similarly, an intrusion detection system, IDS, it is designed to detect unauthorized access to systems or intrusion attempts as well. Now, it works along with the firewall. Now, the main thing here is that there's a database against which it can compare the traffic. So most of the attacks that we have talked about, there are some distinct signatures that would cause concern or that would highlight that kind of an attack. Most of the organizations try to develop these kind of signatures. They have them in the database and store them on IDS. So that IDS can analyze the incoming traffic, look at patterns from the traffic coming in or going out and compare it to the database of the signatures that it has, and if it matches any of the signatures, it will then detect that as an attack and then send an alert to the administrator. The administrator will then have to manually come in and check it out, and an intrusion prevention system can be configured to react to that particular event. So if it detects something that can be classified as an intrusion, an administrator can pre-configure it to react to that particular packet in a particular manner. For example, drop the packets or reflect them to a honeypot or the administrator or do all of these things at the same time. So as you can see on your screens, there's a hacker, a set of data packets come in and the firewall is not able to analyze the traffic because a firewall cannot analyze the contents of a packet. It can only look at the IP addressing and the ports that have been created or the rules on which those things have been mentioned, and then it allows the data to go through. It reaches the IDS, then looks at two ways to scan. One is a signature that we have just spoken about, where the developer of the IDS creates those signatures and stores them onto the database, or another thing that is known as heuristic scanning, which is nothing but behavioral scanning. So it looks at the behavior of the data, and if the behavior looks malicious, it will then raise an alert and warn the administrator. Then let's come to honeypots. We just discussed in the previous slide that an IPS or an intrusion prevention system can be pre-configured. That is, if it detects an intrusion, it may redirect a traffic to a honeypot. So what is a honeypot? A honeypot is a decoy system. It is created to showcase a certain set of vulnerabilities to try to attract the attention of an attacker. It's more to deceive the attacker. For example, if the attacker has been able to bypass your firewall and your IDS, and now when they can scan the entire subnet, they would come across a device which is pretty vulnerable or showcases some vulnerabilities which would definitely impress the hacker because they would think that it is a vulnerable server which contains some valuable data, and that is exactly what honeypot is. It's a decoy server trying to act as a production server, trying to showcase that it has some valuable data, but also has some vulnerabilities in it, so that the attacker can be attracted towards it and spend some time trying to attack it or analyze the honeypot. At the same time, the honeypot will analyze the data traffic and it will warn the administrator of a possible intrusion, which will give the administrator enough time to secure the rest of the network. And they can also analyze the logs of the honeypot, trying to understand what kind of attacks that hacker is trying to create, and try to reverse engineer and identify the attacker at the same time. Moving on, let's now talk about cybersecurity goals, that is CIA. And we are not talking about the Central Intelligence Agency here. We're talking about the CIA triad, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. This becomes the baseline for every security professional. At any point in time, it is a CIA that we are trying to implement in an organization to ensure that our information security is at a very acceptable level. Now, what is confidentiality, integrity, and availability? Confidentiality is the aspect where we can manipulate the data or we can configure a data to be accessible only to authorized people. Now, when we say authorized, you're basically creating rules and responsibilities where I have to authorize some people to get access and not authorize some people to get access to a certain amount of data. For example, if you have stored some data on a central store, like let's say everybody has a Dropbox or a OneDrive, right? And how do you protect your Dropbox or OneDrive? You have a username and password. You may enhance it using a one-time password or multi-factor authentication to access the OneDrive. This is where the confidentiality comes in, where you're going to protect the data in such a way that it cannot be accessed by unauthorized users. So the first thing that you want to look at is how do you manage authorization. The second aspect is integrity, that is the trustworthiness of that data. Now, if you're talking about the data that is stored on your OneDrive, we would want to keep it confidential by giving it an authentication mechanism. Here, you have to identify by using your username and password. Then an OTP is either emailed or sent to your mobile phone. You type in the OTP to access that data. Now, when you're accessing that data, how can you be sure that the data has not been modified by a hacker? Somebody may have gotten their hands on your password. They would have logged in and accessed that data. They modified it and that data is no longer trustworthy. So how do you maintain the integrity and trustworthiness of that data? So here we use hashing algorithms where we take hash values of certain files and ensure that the integrity of that data is assured. The third aspect is availability. The best way I can make my data confidential and trustworthy is I can lock it up in a safe, take it to the ocean and drop it in at the bottom of the ocean so that nobody can access it. But that data has no value when it cannot be accessed by anyone or any authorized person when they require it. So, for that data to be valuable for me, I need to have access to that data whenever I require it. We are basically juggling along this triangle where we want to keep the security in such a way that the data is confidential, it's trustworthy, and at the same time that it is highly available to all the authorized users. We always have been taking the example of OneDrive. Has it ever happened that OneDrive was not available over the internet at any point in time? Maybe a couple of times in the past few years, but 99% of the time it's always available. So they ensure that the data center that they have created is redundant in such a way that no matter what happens, the data on your OneDrive software and the service that they are providing will always be made available to you. So here your business continuity planning, disaster recovery planning, change management, service management would come into the picture where you're going to create a robust plan of how these things are going to work together and make that infrastructure available at all points in time. Now let's move on to our next topic, and that is about tackling cybercrime. If you remember a few slides back, we talked about information security. Information security could be about anything normally contained within the organization, the data that the organization has, and us securing this data by introducing the security controls that we talked about. Cybersecurity would be something that is on the internet or on the web. Any web applications that I have deployed on the internet, any database that I have that would talk about cybersecurity. So if your Facebook account gets hacked or your OneDrive gets hacked, that's where the cybersecurity comes into picture. But if your physical computer gets hacked because your password got cracked by a physical attack, that's where your information security is. So some of the basic ways of preventing cyber attacks on us. First and foremost, use unique and strong passwords. We have just discussed the complexity of the passwords. We want to keep them random. They should not be guessable, they should not be based on dictionary words, and they should be randomized in such a way that they cannot be predicted or guessed. The length of the password should be very good. The bare minimum should be 8 characters. Even that is not suggested in today's world. It has to be at least 12 to 16 characters. An operating system in today's world will support up to 24 or 26 characters. If you go into encryption software, they support up to 60 odd characters of passwords. So you want to keep those unique, you want to recycle those passwords on a regular basis. You do not want to reuse old passwords again and again. The second measure is avoid public Wi-Fi. We always look for free Wi-Fi. We go to coffee shops because they advertise free Wi-Fi. That's nowadays a unique selling point for coffee shops and establishments. We go there, connect to the Wi-Fi and serve whatever we want. The problem is you have no idea who else is connected to that Wi-Fi and what kind of attacks they are creating. So public Wi-Fis are very risky, and if your security is not up to the mark, you might just end up getting hacked like nobody's business. The third measure is ignore and delete mails from unknown senders. Phishing attacks are very common attacks in today's world. You get an email saying you have won a lottery or you've been chosen for something or please click here to download your free software. Such emails are plenty nowadays. Always ask the question, if you won a lottery, did you purchase the ticket? No, so there's never a free lunch, right? Always keep on questioning the things that you have been getting. I'm not saying ignore them because some of them may actually come true. There's always that 1% hope, but always investigate those things to see whether they are spam or there is a fraud going on. And if yes, you can communicate with the law enforcement agency and try to figure out who's responsible for that fraud. The fourth measure, make use of antivirus software and always keep it updated. Do not go for free antivirus softwares because they may be good at detecting infections, but when it comes to disinfecting those files, then that's where they ask for money. That's when you're going to run around and say, okay, let me see which is a very good antivirus to disinfect this kind of infection. There are a lot of antiviruses out there, and I know that it's very confusing which is the best one today. The problem is, whichever is the best one in the market may not be the best one for the operating system that you are using. For example, there would be a good antivirus for Windows 7, but the same antivirus installed on Windows 8 or Windows 10 wouldn't be that effective. The best way to look at antiviruses and identify which antivirus suits you is to investigate that antivirus and see the detection rate of that antivirus. What you can do is you can head on to a website called virustotal.com. It's a Google-owned website. They have around 60 to 70 odd scanners on that website and have most of the known antivirus scanners. Try to figure out if you can get hold of an infected file. Be very careful. You don't want to infect your computer. You can upload it to that particular website, analyze the file and see which antivirus detects those kind of viruses. The fifth measure, use multi-factor authentication or a two-step process for authentication. Don't just rely on a username and password. Registered devices get OTP either on your email or on your devices. That gives you an added layer of security. If your password gets compromised, that's still okay because now the hacker will need to simulate your phone as well. There are so many other people who don't use these kind of techniques. They can be hacked much easier than people who have an added layer of security introduced. And finally, be very careful when you're downloading apps. On your mobile phones, you still have a certain level of security where you can go to the Apple Marketplace or the Google Play Store and they do have some level of control. But when you talk about Windows operating systems, you're going to open the internet to look for different kinds of software. You have no idea whether the website that you're on is trustworthy or is hosted by a hacker with a malware on that particular file that you're downloading, especially if you're downloading a pirated program. Never download a pirated program. When you're downloading an executable file, you can upload it to virustotal.exe, scan it to see if there are any viruses or malware within it. The website also helps you analyze URLs to see if the URL itself may have any malicious attacks within them. So you can use that website to scan the apps that you're downloading and see if there's anything malicious about those apps. So that was all about our cybersecurity training for this session. Before wrapping up this session, I'd like to address a few questions from you viewers. I can see that we have a few repeatedly asked questions from our viewers. Let me address a couple of those questions. The first question that I'm taking up is, I want to start a career in cybersecurity. What steps should I take? Well, there is no one genuine path to working in cybersecurity. You should have a bachelor's degree in any relevant field and have a deep abiding interest to know how cybersecurity works. You must also possess a relevant job experience, preferably in the field of IT. You should have knowledge of network configuration, TCP/IP, network protocols, firewalls, VPNs, and operating systems. Apart from these, you need to know the secure coding practices, threat modeling, virtualization technologies, encryption technologies, and database management systems. After you're well versed with these skills, go for a few certifications that can push your career one step further, depending on your interest. I would suggest you look for certifications like CEH, CompTIA Security Plus, CISM, to name a few. Once you have the desired knowledge and experience, you can become a security analyst, a cybersecurity engineer, a security consultant, or a cybersecurity architect. So I hope I have answered your question. The next question I would like to take up is, what coding language should I know to learn cybersecurity? So yes, you might be wondering if coding is really required to become a cybersecurity professional. Well, it is true that not all cybersecurity professionals have or need coding skills. However, having zero coding knowledge may limit your opportunities in the future. Knowing a couple of programming languages will help you identify the plan behind an attack and defend against deadly hacking techniques. C and C++ will be really helpful. The C programming language is the backbone of most operating systems. C and C++ are low-level programming languages that you need to know as a cybersecurity professional. On the other hand, Python is a high-level programming language that is becoming popular among cyber experts today. Knowing Python will give you an upper hand in your career. It will help you identify and fix vulnerabilities. And a final pick is HTML. HTML is another language cybersecurity professionals should understand as most websites use it, and it is one of the easiest languages to learn. Repeat. So I hope I've addressed your question on coding languages for cybersecurity. If you have any more questions, please put them in the chat section below and we'll be happy to answer them. And with that, we have reached the end of this session by Simplilearn on cybersecurity training for beginners. I hope you guys found this informative and helpful. Thank you for watching, stay safe and keep learning.